April 1943, Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. A small, nondescript building houses the armament laboratory of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Inside, engineers and statisticians are analyzing thousands of gun camera films from combat operations over Europe and North Africa. What they're discovering is shocking. American fighter pilots are missing far more often than they should given the quality of their aircraft and training. Pilot after pilot attacks German aircraft from directly behind, centering the target in the gun sight, opening fire at what appears to be perfect range. The tracers stream toward the enemy aircraft and miss. Aircraft that should be destroyed escape unscathed. Pilots who execute textbook attacks return to base reporting no damage observed or target escaped. Analysis of gun camera films reveals a troubling pattern. Hit rates against crossing targets are approximately 2 to 4%, far lower than expected given modern aircraft and armament. Expected hit rates should be substantially higher. Something fundamental is wrong with American gunnery training, tactics, or both. But what? The answer lies in physics, specifically, the ballistics of projectiles meeting moving targets. Engineers begin calculating. A fighter closing on another fighter at combined closing speed of perhaps 400 miles per hour combined, approximately 590 feet per second. The American fighters, P-47 Thunderbolt, P-51 Mustang, P-38 Lightning, mount weapons with muzzle velocities around 2,800 feet per second. The time required for a .50 caliber bullet to travel from the fighter's guns to a target 200 yards ahead is approximately 1/3 of a second. But here's the critical calculation. In that 1/3 second, the target aircraft moves approximately 197 feet forward. If the pilot aims directly at the target's current position and fires, the bullets travel to where the target was, not where it is when the bullets arrive. The target is already gone. The entire burst passes behind it. This is the fundamental error in American gunnery training. Pilots are taught to aim at the target, but in high-speed aerial combat, you don't aim at where the target is. You aim at where the target will be when your bullets arrive, a concept called deflection shooting or leading the target. It's identical to shooting at moving game in hunting. If you aim at a running deer, you miss. You must lead the deer, aim ahead of its path so the deer runs into your shot. American fighter pilots, most trained on ground ranges where targets were stationary or moved predictably, had never truly mastered deflection shooting. Combat revealed this massive training gap. Pilots were aiming behind the target every time they shot, and most didn't understand why they were missing. These findings were presented to 8th Air Force leadership. The analysis revealed a fundamental training doctrine problem. American pilots were trained to aim at targets, but in high-speed aerial combat, success required aiming at where targets would be when bullets arrived. Giles, understanding the implications, authorizes comprehensive gunnery retraining. Engineers develop new training methods by consulting with developing new training methods. He consults with experienced combat pilots, reviews successful engagement films, calculates optimal lead distances for various closing speeds and target angles. He develops a comprehensive doctrine of deflection shooting, adapted specifically for fighter versus fighter combat at typical engagement ranges. The key insight is simple but revolutionary. Train pilots to aim ahead of targets at calculated distances depending on closing speed and angle of attack. Create training methods that condition the brain to automatically calculate lead distances. Use gun camera film to demonstrate successful tactics and failed tactics. Drill the concept until it becomes intuitive rather than analytical. New training emphasizing deflection shooting began implementation in May 1943. Fighter pilots undergoing gunnery retraining learned that deflection shooting requires understanding 3 variables: closing speed, range, and angle of attack. At 400 miles per hour closing speed at 200 yards range, a pilot must lead a target directly ahead by approximately 50 to 60 feet, 15 to 18 meters. At 500 miles per hour closing speed, the lead increases to approximately 60 to 75 feet. At oblique angles, attacking from the side or quarter, the lead distances are different, calculated using more complex trigonometry. Rather than making pilots calculate during combat, the new training teaches intuitive leading. Pilots practice on towed targets, attacking the sleeve rather than aiming at its current position, but aiming ahead where they anticipate it will be. Instructors provide constant feedback. You're shooting behind. Lead more. Further ahead. Aim in front of the sleeve. Gradually, the brain adapts. The calculation becomes unconscious. Pilots develop the same intuitive leading they'd use hunting. The new training also emphasizes range judgment and closing speed estimation, critical for calculating correct lead. Too much lead and you miss ahead of the target. Too little and you miss behind. Pilots learned to judge range using the target's angular size in the gun sight, a technique requiring practice but achievable with discipline. Starting in May 1943, deflection shooting training began implementation across 8th Air Force fighter units, with gradual adoption continuing through late 1943 and into 1944. Gun camera films from missions now show dramatically different engagement patterns. Pilots approach targets head-on or at quarter angles rather than straight astern. They fire at calculated points ahead of targets. The tracers, instead of streaming behind targets and missing, now intersect target paths. Hits increase dramatically. The tactical impact becomes apparent within weeks. Fighter versus fighter kill ratios improved during 1943, with factors including improved gunnery training emphasizing deflection shooting, accumulation of combat experienced pilots, aircraft design improvements, and American numerical superiority contributing to increasingly favorable kill ratios by late 1943. American pilots were already better trained and equipped than German opponents, but they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs through poor gunnery training, teaching them to lead targets unleashed their actual capability. The numbers become compelling. During mid-1943, 8th Air Force fighter pilots' combat effectiveness was limited by inadequate gunnery training despite superior aircraft and resources. As new training methods emphasizing deflection shooting were gradually implemented across fighter units in mid to late 1943, combat effectiveness improved measurably. By late 1943, units equipped with improved gunnery training showed consistent improvements in kill ratios and enemy aircraft destroyed compared to earlier months. German fighter losses accelerated. Experienced German pilots confident in their fighters' performance suddenly began dying to American attacks they couldn't counter. They were flying the same aircraft, Messerschmitt Bf 109G, Focke-Wulf 190A they'd flown previously, but they were facing American pilots who now understood how to actually hit them. The Germans noticed the change. Combat reports began noting American fighters demonstrating improved gunnery. Multiple reports of direct hits from longer range than previously observed, pilot losses increasing. German fighter pilots did note changes in American gunnery effectiveness during 1943. Historical reports indicate that German pilots observed American fighters demonstrating improved accuracy and hit rates as the year progressed, particularly in engagements where deflection shooting techniques appeared more effectively employed. The scientific analysis supporting the new training evolved throughout 1943. The Armament Laboratory conducted detailed ballistic calculations for every American fighter aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolt with 6.50 caliber machine guns, P-51 Mustang with 8.50 caliber machine guns, P-38 Lightning with 4.50 caliber machine guns, and 120mm cannon. They calculated optimal firing distances, maximum effective ranges, and lead calculations for standard attack angles. The detailed ballistic calculations were performed for various fighter aircraft types and attack geometries. For example, typical rear-quarter attacks on fighters at standard engagement ranges required lead calculations of 40 to 60 feet, depending on closing speed and target maneuvering. Accuracy within 15 to 20 feet of the calculated lead was necessary for high hit probability. This precision seemed impossible during combat. Pilots couldn't measure with such accuracy while flying at high speed with enemy fire incoming. But here's the key. Through training, pilots developed intuitive feel for the correct lead. It's the same way a baseball player learns to hit a fastball. The calculation is unconscious but accurate. Years of practice conditioning the nervous system create automatic response. The training also included critical safety briefings. Pilots were warned that deflection shooting could lead to overshooting targets. Firing at calculated points ahead of enemies risked hitting friendly aircraft if spacing was miscalculated or if additional aircraft were nearby. Discipline was essential. Pilots must positively identify targets, confirm no friendlies were in the firing path, calculate lead precisely, and only fire when certain of hitting intended target without risking friendly casualties. The doctrine spread to all American fighter forces globally. Pacific Theater fighters received the training by late 1943. By 1944, all American fighter pilots were trained in deflection shooting. The results were consistent. Combat effectiveness improved dramatically. Kill ratios that had been 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 against Japanese fighters became 8-to-1, 10-to-1, and occasionally exceeding 15-to-1. The tactical adaptation extended beyond simple deflection shooting training. Experienced pilots developed additional techniques. High-side attacks were particularly effective, approaching from above into the side of a target, firing at calculated lead, then braking hard to avoid the target's return fire. Lag pursuit attacks, following targets at slightly slower speed and slightly above, allowed long-duration firing opportunities. Energy fighting combined with deflection shooting made American fighter tactics devastatingly effective. Major Richard Dick Bong Pacific Theater fighter ace who scored 40 confirmed victories, highest-scoring American pilot of the war, credited deflection shooting training with his success. The doctrine changed everything, Bong reflected. Before, I'd attack and miss repeatedly. After learning to lead targets properly, I was hitting more consistently. Every pass was productive. The enemy couldn't evade effectively if I was firing ahead rather than at them. Deflection shooting was the difference between being a mediocre fighter pilot and being dangerous. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemk, European theater ace with 17.75 confirmed victories, emphasized the importance of training consistency. The real revolution wasn't discovering deflection shooting. Experienced pilots had known the principle for years. The revolution was systematizing the training so that average pilots could become good pilots and good pilots could become exceptional. Every pilot in my squadron receiving the same training at the same standard meant predictable tactical effectiveness. We flew as a coordinated unit with consistent doctrine. That consistency defeated individually superior but tactically disorganized opponents. The physics underlying deflection shooting are straightforward but counterintuitive. Fighter pilots, despite training emphasizing accuracy, have an innate tendency to aim at targets. This worked against stationary targets on ground ranges. It failed against moving targets in combat, teaching pilots to overcome this instinct, to deliberately aim away from where targets currently are, and instead aim where calculations predict targets will be, required rewiring automatic responses. The training methodology evolved through 1943-1944. Initial attempts at classroom instruction followed by range practice were ineffective. Pilots understood the concept intellectually but couldn't execute under pressure. Effective training required repetition, hundreds of practice approaches, each with feedback correction. Progressive difficulty, starting with slow targets, advancing to faster targets, varying closing speeds. Combat realistic scenarios, training in formations against multiple targets with defensive threats simulated. Gun camera review. After each training flight, instructors reviewed film with pilots, demonstrating what worked and what failed. Intuitive development, continuing training until calculation became unconscious. Experienced combat pilots serving as instructors proved critical. New pilots learning from other pilots, rather than career ground instructors, understood the training's relevance. Combat veterans could say, "This is exactly what I did when I got my last 3 kills," or "This mistake is why I missed when I had perfect opportunity." Personal credibility made training effective. The doctrine also addressed formation flying. American fighters typically flew in 4-ship flights, lead and wingman, second element lead and wingman. The lead pilot bore primary responsibility for finding and engaging enemies. The wingman's job was supporting the lead, preventing enemies from getting behind him, protecting him from surprise attacks. This formation made deflection shooting training critical for lead pilots but less critical for wingmen. However, wingmen still needed to understand deflection principles for their supporting role. German tactical organization differed significantly. German units typically flew in pairs, each pilot responsible for attacking and defending himself. This encouraged individual initiative but made coordinated tactics difficult. When American fighters arrived with superior training and tactics, German pairs were outmaneuvered and defeated by American flights using superior coordination and deflection shooting. The technology also mattered. American aircraft, particularly the P-51 Mustang, had gunsights optimized for deflection shooting. The Norden gunsight, standard on P-51s by late 1943, featured a circular reticle calibrated for bullet drop at various ranges. Pilots could adjust the sight for expected range, then use the reticle to calculate lead. The sight was mechanical rather than electronic, but sophisticated enough to support deflection calculations. German aircraft units were competent but less sophisticated. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G used a simpler reflector sight without built-in lead calculation. German pilots compensated with superior individual marksmanship through extensive training, but the technological advantage favored American designs when combined with proper training methodology. The industrial implications were significant. If American pilots could achieve 10-to-1 kill ratios instead of 2-to-1 kill ratios through training improvements alone, This was equivalent to multiplying fighter effectiveness without building more aircraft or consuming additional industrial resources. 1,000 P-51s flown by well-trained pilots with deflection shooting doctrine were far more effective than those same 1,000 aircraft flown with poor gunnery training. Training became strategic resource in its own right. Quantifying the training's impact is possible through careful analysis. Fighter units receiving deflection shooting training early, May through July 1943, immediately showed improved kill ratios and increased enemy aircraft destroyed. Units receiving training later, late 1943 and 1944, showed similar improvements correlating with training dates. Controlled comparison between units trained and not yet trained showed consistent improvement of approximately 100 to 150% in combat effectiveness following training conversion. Additional evidence comes from gun camera film analysis. Films before training showed bullets missing targets consistently despite close range. Films after training showed bullets hitting targets regularly. The improvement was objective and measurable. The armament laboratory accumulated thousands of films demonstrating the principle. Proper deflection shooting doctrine produced hits. Improper aiming doctrine produced misses. The German response to American gunnery improvements included several attempts at technological countermeasure. Armor plating installed on vulnerable areas of German fighters provided some protection against rounds missing perfect hit zones. Performance improvements, faster climb, better maneuverability, allowed evasion of some attacks. But fundamentally, superior American training and doctrine could not be countered by equipment modifications alone. German pilot training attempted to emphasize deflection shooting as well, but lacked systematic programs matching American efforts. German doctrine also emphasized different tactics, rigid formation flying, concentrated fire on single targets, that sometimes worked but lacked the flexibility American tactics provided. Additionally, German training pipeline was already degrading by 1943 due to pilot losses exceeding replacement capacity. Experienced instructors were in combat rather than training new pilots. Training quality inevitably declined. The strategic bomber community eventually adopted similar deflection shooting training for tail gunners. Heavy bomber defensive armament relied on gunners shooting at pursuing fighters. Traditional training taught aiming at incoming fighters. New training emphasized calculating lead, understanding that a fighter approaching head-on at 500 miles per hour combined closing speed requires significant forward lead despite appearing to be approaching directly. Bomber crew gunnery effectiveness improved measurably through deflection shooting training. The doctrine's application extended beyond fighter versus fighter combat. Ground attack pilots using guns against vehicles and structures applied deflection principles. Pilots strafing moving ground targets, trucks, trains, convoys, learned to aim ahead of moving vehicles rather than at them. Tank-busting pilots attacking armor learned deflection shooting for close-range gun attacks. The principle proved universal. Any gunnery application involving moving targets benefited from proper deflection understanding. Post-war, the gunnery doctrine influenced subsequent fighter designs. Aircraft gunsights became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating mechanical and later electronic computers to calculate lead automatically. The gyroscopic gunsight, introduced late in World War II and refined afterward, measured target angular velocity through gyroscopic sensing and automatically adjusted the aiming point to compensate for target motion. The human calculation of deflection became electronic calculation, but the principle remained. Modern aircraft with radar-guided missiles largely eliminated the need for deflection shooting in air-to-air combat. Missiles do their own guidance. Targeting computer calculates interception curves. Missile guidance system steers the missile to impact. But the principle remains implicit. Weapons are guided to where targets will be, not where they currently are. The calculation evolved from pilot manual estimation to electronic automation, but the fundamental physics remained unchanged. Fighter pilots trained in the 1950s and 1960s, before missiles became dominant, received deflection shooting training, continuing the World War II methodology. Pilots who transitioned to supersonic fighters still practiced deflection at low speed before engaging enemies at high speed where missiles were used. The training proved valuable for dogfighting in close quarters, where missiles were ineffective, situations that occurred occasionally in Korea and more frequently in Vietnam. American fighter pilots trained in Vietnam-era conflicts continued to employ close-range gunnery principles derived from World War II deflection shooting doctrine. These principles remained relevant for emergency close quarters, combat situations where long-range missiles were ineffective. The fundamental physics of projectile interception, calculating where targets would be when bullets arrived, remained unchanged despite advances in aircraft speed and avionics. The transition to modern air combat, primarily beyond visual range engagement using radar-guided missiles, reduced the practical importance of deflection shooting for current pilots, but military aviation training still includes gun employment for emergency close-range combat scenarios. Pilots still learn that you don't aim at targets, you aim where targets will be. The doctrine persists because the physics persists. The historical significance of American gunnery training improvement is substantial. Between mid-1943 and war's end in 1945, American fighter pilots achieved kill ratios consistently exceeding 8-to-1 against German and Japanese opponents. Earlier in the war, before deflection shooting doctrine was systematized, kill ratios were typically 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. The improvement can be credited partially to equipment advances. Later P-51s were superior to early P-40s, but the training doctrine change produced measurable improvement independent of equipment upgrades. German pilot losses accelerated dramatically during 1943-1944 partially due to American numerical and equipment superiority, but also due to American tactical and training superiority. Experienced German pilots, confident they could defeat American fighters, died in combat finding the Americans suddenly shooting more accurately than before. German leadership observed improved American gunnery effectiveness, but attributed improvements to various factors, including numerical superiority and aircraft design, rather than fully understanding the specific role of deflection shooting training methodology. The story exemplifies how combat effectiveness emerges from multiple factors, including superior training, doctrine, methodology, and equipment. American fighter aircraft improvements, particularly the P-51 Mustang, combined with superior training and accumulating pilot experience, created increasingly significant advantages over German fighters. American training transforming good pilots into exceptional pilots made the difference, teaching pilots to aim where targets will be rather than where they are doubled combat effectiveness. This simple doctrine change produced strategic impact equivalent to building hundreds of additional fighter aircraft. The principle remains relevant in modern military contexts. Training quality often determines combat effectiveness as powerfully as equipment quality. A well-trained soldier with adequate equipment defeats a poorly trained soldier with superior equipment. Superior training methodology produces force multiplication equivalent to equipment improvements. The American gunnery training revolution of 1943 demonstrated this principle with quantifiable clarity. For pilots trained before the doctrine change, the results were frustrating but educational. After implementing deflection shooting training, many pilots who had frustrated themselves with poor shooting suddenly found success. Their courage hadn't changed, their aircraft hadn't changed, their training had changed, and that training change transformed them from marginally effective pilots to superior pilots. This transformation validated the importance of doctrine and training quality.